Hi everyone, welcome to our TWSBI Nib and line comparison video. If you watched our intro video all about TWSBI, you know that TWSBI's fountain pens are, although they have many different models, there are just 3 different nibs. There's the number 4 nib, the number 5 nib, and the number 6 nib, all of which are available in extra fine, fine, medium, broad, and stub. So today I'm just going to be doing line comparisons across these 3 different nib sizes, just to see a little bit of the differences, if there are any differences, and anything that stands out about any of these nibs in particular. So stick around and watch as I compare all the different line widths and talk about how some nibs are different. So we're going to do the line comparison for the TWSBI ECO, the Diamond 580, and the TWSBI Vac 700R. And we're just going to be starting off with the TWSBI ECO. This is a TWSBI ECO. And so the TWSBI ECOs are the ones with the number 4 nibs. And we're going to start at the finest nib that TWSBI has to offer in the ECO models, and this is the extra fine EF, it would say on their nibs, in a really hard to see place actually. So the TWSBI nibs are actually, even though TWSBI is a fountain pen company from Taiwan, the TWSBI nibs are actually German nibs, so they are not as fine as everyone thinks they are. A lot of people are really surprised. So you'll see that these, even the extra fine TWSBI ECO nib is not like, it's not like a sailor or a pilot extra fine at all. So that's just a good thing to note about TWSBI pens. And that's just a little measure of the wetness. So it didn't smear all too much. So there's not a lot of wetness there, but it is like a nice flowing nib. So I'm just gonna do a line here. And I have our COPIC Multiliners to do the line comparison with. And I'm starting here with a 0.3 millimeter line. And we'll see how that compares to this TWSBI extra fine line. Okay, so the 0.3 is actually quite a bit finer than the extra fine line here. So it's going to be, wait, is that correct? Less than 0.3. No, it's not less than 0.3. It's greater than 0.3, sorry. So I'm going to try the 0.5 now to compare. This is the 0.5. And the 0.5 is a little bit thicker than that line over here. So I think it is less than 0.5. So then I'm going to say that the TWSBI extra fine nib is approximately 0.4 millimeters in line width. All right. So this is interesting because, you know, for example, for our pilot line comparison video, we started off the extra fine nib at like a 0.1, and this is already a 0.4. So that right there just will show you that TWSBI nibs are definitely nowhere near as fine as some of the Japanese like fountain pen company nibs are. So next up is the fine F. That's what you'll see on your nib. It's a really smooth nib. I personally really enjoy writing with TWSBI fountain pens, even though, oh, A, B, C, D, E, F, Q. Nope. Even though they are not as fine as some of my favorite sailor or pilot pens, I just really enjoy the flow of these TWSBI nibs. And when I have, I can't remember the letter G today for some reason. But when I'm writing and I really want to show off like a nice ink, or I'm just looking for easy, smooth flowing writing, the TWSBI nibs are a really nice option. And so the fine is actually really close to the extra fine. I'll go so far to say that like there's almost no perceivable difference, to be honest. So let's just do a line and see. Okay, so that's the fine. Going from the extra fine here to the fine, there's not a big difference there at all. Let's draw our lines just to be sure. Have our 0.3, and obviously it's not going to be a 0.3 because even the extra fine wasn't a 0.3. But is it a 0.5? Maybe. Yeah, maybe that's closer to a 0.5. I think that's pretty close to a 0.5, closer to a 0.5 than the extra fine was. So we're going to say that the fine is approximately a 0.5 millimeter line thickness. All right, the next up is the medium nib in the ECO. The medium. Okay, and that I can right away feel that there is a difference in the line weight, the thickness of the line. See how wet this medium is. It feels a lot wetter. Yeah, well, they're actually approximately all the same. They're like not like, the extra fine definitely smeared less. The fine smeared a little bit more. You can see there's like more drag and it's like a darker line that's dragging. And the medium is dragging quite a bit too, but it's not like it's continuously going like some of the other nibs that I've tried in the past, like with music nibs or like coarse nibs from Pilot or anything like that. Okay, I'm gonna do a line for our medium nib and see how thick it is. Ooh, it's quite a bit thicker than the fine. So let's see. The next up in thickness in the COPIC Multiliners is the 0.8. So I'm gonna do a 0.8 and see if that comes close to a 0.8. Okay, that's really pretty close to a 0.8. Yeah, I'm gonna say that's a 0.8. All right, pretty spot on there. The next up in the TWSBI Nib lineup is going to be the Broad Nib. So this is the Broad. Whoa. It's so thick. It's a little scary. And the broad is really smooth, but honestly, I think all of these TWSBI nibs are really very smooth because they're just not very fine to begin with. So, like if they were scratchy, that would be surprising. Okay, and then let's see how wet this is. I already know it's gonna be super wet. Oops. Woo, okay, that smeared a lot because it is a very wet writer, the broad. That's the broad nib, and I'm gonna do my line now and see what line comes closest to it. Wow. So it's definitely thicker than a 0.8, but I don't know if it's quite the next size up. So we will do both lines and we'll see. Here's the 0.8 again. And this is what we said the medium was. And I think it is thicker than the 0.8. So I'm gonna say thicker than 0.8, greater than 0.8. But is it quite a 1.0? That's what we have to see. So here's the 1.0. That's really thick. I don't know. Yeah, I actually think that that broad line is approximately a 1 millimeter line. So that's what we're gonna say. It's a 1.0 millimeter line. And boy, it's a very broad line for sure. So next up in the TWSBI ECO Nib lineup is the 1.1 millimeter stub. So we're gonna say stub 1.1, and it on the pen itself it just has 1.1 because it's a 1.1 millimeter stub. Okay, so that's really nice. And with the stub nibs, I'm not really going to be comparing the line thickness about them because that's really not the point of the stub nibs, and you kind of have the line thickness of them already because it's 1.1. But wait, I did it again. A, B, C, D, E, F, Q. How funny. I just G, H, I, J, K. And the stub nibs are great for calligraphy. That's kind of exactly what their intention is. And I've demonstrated this before with other stub nibs and compared them sort of to music nibs in some other nib lineups. But stub nibs make thick downstrokes and then thin strokes going across on your nib like that. And so as a result, if you angle them when you write on the paper, you know, they make really beautiful calligraphic style writing, especially if you know what you're doing with them. And I need more practice, but you know, it still looks really nice. So that's what the stub looks like for the TWSBI ECO. And that's the number 4 TWSBI nib. All right, so these are the line widths and the nib and line comparisons for the TWSBI number 4 nib, which is found on the ECO, as well as the Go, the Diamond Mini, the Vac Mini, the New Swipe. I think that's all of the models. So the extra fine, the fine, which are really, really similar, and barely discernible. Maybe the fine is just a little bit of a wetter writer, and they have like a difference of maybe 0.1 millimeter. And then going up to the medium, you definitely do see a jump in line thickness there from 0.5 of the fine going to a 0.8. And then a big drastic difference is visible when you go up to the broad nib in the TWSBI Ecos. And this you'll get a line width of 1 millimeter thickness. And then the stub nib, which is great for calligraphic writing. I'm not measuring the line width for them because you can achieve different line widths for them, and they're just kind of fun to play around with. But I'll talk about a little bit later on the differences between some of the different stub nibs across the TWSBI lineups in their different models. So that was the TWSBI Eco, and TWSBI only has 3 different nibs in their pens. So the next nib we will talk about is the TWSBI number 5 nib, which is found on the Diamond 580. It is only found on the TWSBI Diamond 580. So we'll start again. This is the TWSBI Diamond 580, and we'll start again with the extra fine nib. That's EF. Okay. So right away, I'll tell you all that the nibs feel really similar between the Diamond 580 and the TWSBI ECO. And when I was doing my test beforehand, it even surprised me to learn that the line widths of these nibs are fairly similar, but we'll get to see that as we demonstrate this. Okay, so the wetness. Pretty wet, actually. Okay. All right, so here's the line of the TWSBI Diamond 580. Oh, and I forgot to write, but this is a number 5 nib. Okay. Is it a 0.3? Is it a 0.5? We said that the Eco nib was and there's the Eco nib. You can see how similar they are. We said that the Eco nib was about a 0.4 because it was between the 0.3 and the 0.5. And I'm thinking that it's gonna be the same actually for the Diamond 580. So here's the 0.5. I'm gonna draw the line for the 0.5. And we'll see how that compares to the extra fine. I think it's gonna be pretty similar. Yeah. The 0.5, I think, is a little bit thicker than extra fine line there, but like just barely. We'll say that this is a 0.4, which means that it's the same thickness as the TWSBI ECO extra fine, which is pretty impressive how standardized these are. I will say that like the TWSBI nibs are very predictable in what you get. We've tried a lot of them over the years because every time we get a limited edition one or a special color, or there's like a new model that's released, we tend to always open one up to have people test it out in the store, and that's so we can test it out too. And there are some brands of fountain pens, I'm not going to name names, but there are some fountain pens out there that, you know, you're just not sure what kind of nib you're going to get when you open the package. But TWSBI's nibs are always predictable. They don't make their own nibs, but the nibs that they use are consistent. So if you like a TWSBI ECO in the fine or a TWSBI Diamond 580 in the fine, and then you get another one, you're gonna like it. It's gonna be the same pen. And if you have two that are really different, that's like very rare, I will say. In my experience with them, they've always really been very standard, and just, you can always expect quality when you get a TWSBI pen, in my experience. I really like them. Okay, so that's the fine. Actually, I can see here that there's a difference between the extra fine and the fine, but it is very subtle. We're gonna see what the 0.5 line looks like compared to this one again. Okay, so this is the 0.5. I actually think the fine is a little bit thicker than that, which is surprising because to my eye, it looks pretty close to the extra fine, but compared to the 0.5, it looks thicker than the 0.5. So I'm gonna say, but it's just like a little bit thicker. So I'm gonna say it's a 0.6. Okay. Next up, we have the TWSBI Diamond 580 with a medium nib. And there is a difference here in the nib size and the line width that can be seen immediately. Okay, see how wet it is. Pretty equal wetness to the fine. Okay, so that's the medium. That's definitely thicker than the fine, but I think it's a more incremental increase with the Diamond 580. Slightly more incremental increase with the 580 than with the Ecos. Because with the Ecos, the extra fine and the fine are really similar, and then you get a jump to the medium. Whereas with the Diamond 580s, the extra fine is slightly finer than the fine. The fine is slightly finer than the medium, so it's like more incremental, subtle increases in thickness. Let's see which line it is. It's definitely thicker than the 0.5, so let's try the 0.8. Yeah, I think it's about a 0.8. Those are pretty well matched, which is the same as the TWSBI ECO. All right, the next nib up is going to be the TWSBI Diamond 580s Broad Nib. Let's see how that does. This nib has that classic rounded tip that you find on broad nibs. Ooh. So thick. And like, I'm not even used to writing with a broad, which is why it's like coming out a little funny with me, but it's just so thick. Okay. And I think this broad is actually even a little bit thicker than the broad on the Eco Nib. It's subtle, but I think it is a little bit thicker. But let's see. So for the Eco Nib, we chose a 1.0 millimeter. Broad. Whoa. It's such a boxy line too. Is it a 1.0? Yeah, actually I think it's a good, very close to a 1.0. So 1.0. Next up is the Diamond 580 in the Stub Nib. So Stub 1.1. And you can't help but write really big with this because it's so like stubby. Just gotta make these really wide letters. All right. And once again, you know, those thick downstrokes, the thin cross strokes. So something that I've noticed about the Diamond 580 Stub Nib versus the Eco Stub Nib is that it makes thicker lines on those downstrokes. Like you can see, this is the Diamond 580 Stub Nib, and this is the Eco Stub Nib. Even though they're both supposedly 1.1 millimeter stub nibs, this one, the Diamond 580 Stub Nib is a lot stubbier, and it has these thicker downstrokes because the nib is shaped a little bit differently. The edges on the tines of the Diamond 580 are a lot sharper than the tines of the TWSBI ECO. As a result, you get these much sharper, thicker edges than on the Eco here. I hope you can kind of see that these letters are a lot broader or a lot wider than these letters. Last up for TWSBI's nibs are the TWSBI Vac 700R. That's the model of the TWSBI pen. So this is gonna say TWSBI Vac 700R, and this is the number 6 nib. So we'll start off, and it actually comes in the same 5 nib sizes that the other models we've shown today come in. So it's the extra fine, the fine, medium, broad, and stub. So we're starting off with the extra fine. Okay. And this nib is surprisingly different. The nib on the Vac 700R, the extra fine at least, is a lot finer feeling than the extra fine on the Eco and on the Diamond 580. And it's also a lot stiffer feeling. Which is kind of interesting because all the other nibs, across the Diamond 580 and the Eco, are so similar. But here I'm feeling a real difference. You can see this is pretty dry too. For this extra fine number 6 nib, let's see where that goes. Okay, so that's the line. I think, so for the Eco, we had said that was a 0.4, and the Diamond 580 was around a 0.4 as well. I think that it's thicker. This is thick. This one is thicker than a 0.3, but it's pretty close. So I think maybe this should be like a 0.35, not quite a 0.4, because it is definitely finer than the extra fine on those other pens. The next up is the fine nib. And this is definitely thicker than the extra fine, but I'm not sure. I think it feels finer than the other fines. But we'll see in the line comparison. Yeah. It's interesting that this nib feels so different from the other two. It's a 0.5. That comes pretty close. Yeah, I'm gonna say that this is a 0.5, which is slightly finer than the fine nib on the TWSBI Diamond 580, but approximately the same as the fine nib on the TWSBI ECO model. Right, but these are all very close. 700R does feel just a little bit different. It feels a little bit finer across all the nibs. I'll say that for so far. Next up is the Vac 700R and the medium nib. Okay. Yeah, there's a definite slight increase there going up from the fine nib. Okay, so there's the 0.5, and yeah, that's definitely thicker, so greater than the 0.5. Yeah, so it's less than a 0.8. I think I'll call this a 0.7, 0.7. All right, so the next up with the TWSBI number 6 nib in the Broad Nib. And the past few broads that we've tried have been quite thick lines, really juicy writers. So we'll see how this one fares. Broad. Yeah, this broad doesn't feel quite as thick as that of the TWSBI Diamond 580, which was really thick. Okay. Here's the 1.0. That's like way too thick. So it's less than the 1.0. And is it like a 0.8 maybe? Let's try the 0.8. It's probably around a 0.9. All right. Next up is the Stub Nib. So we'll see where these Vac 700R Stub Nibs land. Are they more like the TWSBI ECO Stub Nibs, which have rounder edged tines and make less blocky letters, or are they more like the TWSBI Diamond 580 Stub Nib, which has really like sharp edges on its tines and make really blocky, thick letters? So this is the Stub. Okay. So this nib is definitely closer to the Eco Stub Nib. So it has more rounded edges, I think. And it makes like a thinner downstrokes. So let's see what those downstrokes look like. Yeah, like it is very, it's a very different feeling when you compare the downstrokes of this pen, of this nib, versus the downstrokes of the other nibs. Okay, so here you have it. This is the line comparison for the TWSBI number 6 nib, with the extra fine being probably the thinnest, finest extra fine of all the TWSBI nibs. It's also, I think it's the stiffest nib. This is the extra fine, and that was a line thickness of approximately a 0.35. The fine goes up a little bit to a 0.5, and it's quite close to the thicknesses of the TWSBI Diamond 580 fine and the TWSBI ECO fine. The medium is a good jump up from that as well. And then we get to the broad, which is also a nice little jump, a nice little increase from the medium, and then the stub nib. I would say the The most unique nib in this lineup of the Vac 700Rs is that extra fine, because it does feel a lot finer than you get with an Eco Fine or with a Diamond 580 Fine. So if you're somebody who likes finer pens, but you want to try a TWSBI out, this might be a pen that you like. Now, just to give you a sense of the differences between those stub nibs that we were talking a little bit about earlier, here we have the stub nib comparison. And when you're writing with a stub nib, you just have to, it takes getting used to. I always tell people this in the store, because you have to like keep your nib articulated like against the paper. It has to be like in contact with the paper to really get the full potential of the stub nib. And people have a hard time dealing with that when you're first writing with it. But so this is the TWSBI ECO Stub. And it makes these downstrokes. And then this is the TWSBI Diamond 580 Stub. And it makes these downstrokes. And so right there, just looking at that, you can see how much thicker those downstrokes are compared to the Eco one. And the Vac one comes closer to the Eco one. TWSBI Vac 700R Stub. So those downstrokes. And it's really about those edges, I think. So if you like a classic stubby nib, I think the Diamond 580 stub nib is probably the one for you, because it makes these like almost perfectly angled, very sharp-edged downstrokes that will be really nice. You can see it in these T's here. The big difference between the thickness of that downstroke on the T versus that cross stroke. You can see that really clearly. So the Diamond 580 stub nib is probably closer to like a classic stub nib when you're thinking about choosing a stub nib between all of these different pens. Today we compared the nib sizes across the TWSBI ECO, the TWSBI Diamond 580, and the TWSBI 700R, which are just the TWSBI number 4, number 5, and number 6 nibs. They are overall very similar. So in the extra fine to medium nib sizes, for example, you can see here they're all actually quite close to one another at 0.4, 0.5, 0.8, 0.4, 0.6, 0.8, and 0.35, 0.5, and 0.7. And I think the Vac 700R nib is the one that's a little bit different, but the nibs on the TWSBI ECO and the Diamond are extremely close to one another. The broad nibs are a little bit different from each other as well, with the thickest broad nibs being on the TWSBI Diamond 580 and the TWSBI ECO. The TWSBI ECO having a broad nib thickness of 1 millimeter, and that being the same for the TWSBI Diamond 580. And the Vac 700R's broad nib being just a little bit finer, but overall really, really similar. And then the stub nibs, we did a final comparison earlier, and these are also where these pens really differ as well, with the TWSBI Diamond 580 stub nib standing out for its thick downstrokes relative to the downstrokes that are found on the TWSBI ECO Stub and the TWSBI Vac 700R Stub, which they're like weaker downstrokes, because I feel like what you really want to do when you're getting a stub nib is get a pen that can make very different line widths when you're going across versus down, so that those stand out visually when you're doing your calligraphy and your lettering. And that's kind of what you get automatically when you choose the Diamond 580 stub, and you don't necessarily get that as clear with the ECO stub and the Vac 700R stub. Thank you guys so much for watching our TWSBI line comparison video. I hope you learned a little bit something about TWSBI's nibs, and hopefully you found the right one for yourself if you're not familiar with different TWSBI nibs. Something that surprised me about the different TWSBI nibs is that they are, for the most part, very similar across all the different nibs for the different line widths. So there's great consistency across the number 4, the number 5, and the number 6 nibs. And where they stand out are some of the stub nibs, and the nib in general that stands out is the number 6 nib for being just a little bit finer overall than the number 4 and the 5 nib. So that's the nib that's found on the Vac 700R. Do you guys have a favorite TWSBI nib that you have? Let us know in the comments.